All right, so here we go. Falling Down the Escalator by David, performed by H2. Go ahead, David.
I was just saying thank you. The ending is kind of weird when you can see the score. Like part of the piece is that you're not quite sure when it's over, but if you're looking at the score, it's pretty clear.
Yeah, I think that actually takes away from it a little bit. From you don't want the muggles to be able to see the score.
That's right.
It's nice that we were able to see it. Did anybody notice anything particular? Like, which instrument's playing the last note? Very sax, right? But in what range?
Very high range.
Very high range, and that's like having the saxophones like move in a direction so that they're playing in a similar range, even though there's soprano, two altos, or a soprano, alto, tenor, and vary, and they're all kind of pushing towards the same range of life. And I've talked to Dr. McDonald about this before. It's one of the things I think is cool about it. Dave, why don't you tell us about where this piece has traveled in the world since it was written?
This piece, I guess the premiere was at the University of South Carolina, no, Georgia, University of Georgia, and that was at the North American Saxophone Alliance Conference, and it was also performed at the World Saxophone Congress in Bangkok, Thailand, and they've played it. They've taken this thing on tour because if you're going to spend all the time to learn a piece like this, you're going to play it a lot. So they've been very good about getting a lot of performances of it, and this recording is really wonderful that they spent a lot of time on.
So writing a piece for up-and-comers equals piece gets played all over the planet, which is a good thing, and has led to a commissioning project for 2 members. Why don't you tell us about that, Dave?
Well, there's not a lot to say. I'm working on just starting to work on a piece for the 2 of the members of this group. One of them is the guy playing soprano, and the other is the guy playing alto on the recording that we just listened to. And they are going to be premiering that this summer in France.
So he can say, like, Dr. McDonald's music has been played all over Southeast Asia and Europe, is what he can put on his resume now, right?
That's right. It's very important.
It is very important, actually. And the reason I'm asking about the commissioning project that he has now that came out of this and how the piece has been played all over the place is in a pre-response to a question that I predict will come up later. And Dr. McDonald knows what I'm talking about. We'll just see if I'm right. So, does anybody have a question for our guest? Anybody? Everybody's assignment is to come up with a cool question to make me look good. It could be about pre-compositional process. It could be about rehearsal technique.
I just have a question about the piece.
Okay.
Did you decide that you were going to write a piece that sounded like someone falling up or down?
Up to down.
Yeah. Did you decide that you were going to write a piece that sounded like that, or were you just writing it and you sort of realized that that's what it sounded like?
Somewhere in between. I started writing this kind of repeating upward figure, and the title is more descriptive than prescriptive, I suppose. Which I've told several friends that, and at least a couple of them have found it disappointing. They like to imagine that I had this image in my head and wrote this piece about it, but it's kind of more the other direction this particular time. It's not always that way, but this one was.
Right. I mean, a lot of times people will imagine, a lot of younger composers will get an idea in their head, and it's an amorphous sound coupled with a title. And you can become slavishly attached to the idea that title, even though the idea in reality is very amorphous and has no real form, slavishly addicting yourself to it can actually be bad, right? Anyone else? Come on. I'm going to start calling on people and forcing you to ask a question. Jeremy.
When you write, do you write on a piano, or do you write, did you write that on when you played saxophone, or what was that?
Well, I'm not a saxophonist. I happen to have heard a lot of saxophone music, just being friends with saxophonists for a long time. But I'm also not a great pianist. I use the piano as a tool. But it's mostly on paper and in my head. At some point when it gets too complicated for me to play on the piano, then I start to put some pieces of it into the computer, but most of it's kind of the small nuggets of ideas I noodle out on the piano and write, and then from there it immediately starts getting written down on paper. The one of the first things I do for a lot of pieces, especially a piece like this where it's a relatively small chamber ensemble, is that I make myself a cheat sheet of some things that I want to play around with. Sometimes that is just going to be like the ranges of the instruments and maybe a little bit of a description of what each of those sound like to me or what I think I want to do with the low range or the high range or whatever. And that process is what caused me to realize that there is almost exactly, I think it's almost exactly an octave that all four of the saxophones in this piece share. So the very highest octave of the bari is the same as the very lowest octave of the soprano. And that's where a lot of the ideas of playing around with the different timbres of each instrument in the same pitch space came about. So the idea of passing around that 5/16th note motive at the beginning, where they're all literally on the same sounding pitches, comes from that. And also later, as the tune is exposed I think of it as kind of the cantus firmus at letter D. That whole tune is inside of the notes that all four instruments share. So that's why it's written in that specific range in the 16th. That allows the 16ths to go up, above, and below it in pretty much equal measure.
So it's like spending time investigating. It's sort of like pure science, right? You want to know about what you're working with. The same way, like rewriting the text of the song, where you're talking about somebody instead of talking as the speaker, might reveal a lot of ideas. Taking a singer and making them write a hand clapping piece to investigate rhythm, even though that might not have anything to do with what they compose eventually, might give you ideas about how to use them, how to effectively use rhythm. Austin, you had a question.
I was actually going to ask, do you ever get inspiration like vividly, visually? Like, have you ever looked at a painting? Because this kind of reminds me of
So I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Yeah.
Oh, well, the piece kind of reminds me of like old Bugs Bunny cartoons and stuff like that. It's very dreamlike and carries back. I was wondering if you ever had that as kind of an influence, like something visual.
Sometimes, but usually, to me, when I'm thinking of my music, I'm usually thinking of it almost as an abstraction. I'm thinking about the performance as the end result. Sometimes I think when I think visually, I'm usually thinking of the person performing the piece. So I especially when I'm writing for people that I know personally and I've seen them play a bunch of times, I kind of know, how everybody's kind of got their little dance moves that they do when they're playing. And then, so when I was writing this piece, I kind of imagined these four people playing this piece. But that's as visual as it was.
I think we could more broadly ask the question: do you ever use extra musical ideas pre-compositionally or in process to form the actual, to inform your decisions about your compositional moves?
Not really. Like I said, I'm usually thinking pretty much abstractly with the sounds interacting, and sometimes I imagine the sounds interacting in visual ways or something like that, or in physical space, but the sounds themselves are to me the end result, and any other extra musical things that come out of that are secondary.
Yeah. Dr. MacDonald and I are kind of cut from the same cloth when it comes to that stuff. Music can't say it was a dark and stormy night, Sir Gawain strapped on his armor, blah, blah, blah. Now, you're welcome to think that when you're composing the piece, but you can't put that expectation on an audience, right? If it helps you, I don't care. but it's not something that transfers. Would you agree, Dave?
I guess so. I think you can get a lot out of a nice poetic title. Can say a lot about the piece, and that's as much of a program as I need most of the time. But I think there's a distinction between like an extensive specific program and something that's more along the lines of like a character piece, where you're thinking about the like, for example, one of my students right now is writing a piece that is called Electromagnetism, and he is writing about different kinds of energies in physics, and is doing things with the sounds that to him represent these different kinds of electromagnetic energy in different ways that electromagnetic energy expresses itself. And I don't think I would hear that as, like, I wouldn't listen to that and think, oh yeah, that sounds like concepts I learned in university physics class 12 years ago. But I would say that when he tells me that it is that thing, that I can hear what he's talking about. Like, this pole sucking in electrons, and I can hear, like, there's all this filigree energy representing electrons that all kind of collapses onto one point, and I can hear that.
Right. I think the issue is that if it works for the composer, it doesn't matter that even his composition teacher can't hear it. If it works for him and aids in his process, then fine. I would never ask someone to stop doing it. It's interesting he mentioned the title being the program. Does everybody understand what we mean when we say programmatic music? It lays out a story or something or other that guides the way you listen to it. Like Strauss tone poems, Don Quixote, we understand the story and it's portraying the story. Flutter-tonguing bassoons or bleeding sheep, etc., etc. But the first programmatic element in any piece is the title. If Jeremy had called his piece, instead of, he called it, what is it?
A Glimpse of Things to Come.
A Glimpse of Things to Come, which is very suggestive about the composer himself. But if he called it Brass Quintet No. 1, people's, like, it sets them up to hear something, and I think if he called it Brass Quintet No. 1, the way they set up to hear it would have been a little different. You see what we're getting at? So keep that in mind. And also keep in mind that, don't put too much weight on yourself for your title. You don't write a check that your music is not going to be able to cash, not because you're not able, but just because, we're not writing a gigantic piece. Anybody else have any questions? Come on.
Do you self-publish, or do you have a publisher?
My music is, if it is available at all, it is self-published. This piece and one or two others I make available, though, to be perfectly honest, if somebody just asked me for a copy, I would probably just give it to them.
Yeah. I mean, Dave and I are friends, obviously, but certain composers, if you ask, hey, would you do a Masterclass? They might say yes, they might say no, but then just the act of getting them to give you a score for your students to study might be a tricky thing. I think that's an antiquated way of thinking about it, really. I don't think giving a copy of the score to my composition class is going to steal any money. Okay.
I mean, the amount of money that I would get from selling it is really, really tiny. I mean, the amount I do have it available, and I have sold a few copies, but it's not paying my rent or anything, and I don't expect it to. I don't have that goal for my sheet music sales.
Right, but earning something for yourself by selling or distributing a piece is not the money as much as it is other things, right?
Correct, and I maybe by somebody seeing a copy of it somewhere or me giving them a copy, they might decide they really like my music and commission me to write another piece. I mean, I would much rather, if I am to earn money from my compositions, I would much rather earn money from people commissioning me than from selling, 200 copies of my saxophone quartet. I mean, there aren't 200 saxophone quartets in the world that can play this piece, probably.
Excellent point. Fabian, by the way, said, do you think that we could put together some of the better sax players here to do that? And I had to chuckle. I'm like, I might be able to play one of the parts if I practiced for 6 months, and I wouldn't.
I will say we've got an undergraduate student saxophone quartet here at UCF that's going to take a swing at it this semester, and I've heard, I haven't heard them as a group play, but I have heard all of them as individuals play, and I think they'll be able to do a nice job of it.
Well, that actually brings up a point. I think this piece might actually sort of, air quotes, suffer even from the fact that H2 is so good because they play so even up and down their horns that they disguise the fact that they're all playing in the same range on 4 differently sized horns. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I showed this score to someone recently who had heard the recording, and the passage in the middle where you start to hear the tune in those long notes that is alternating to a different player once every measure or so, they didn't realize that it was shared among all 4 players.
Yeah.
Some of the scales, it didn't sound like they were passing them back and forth, and that's really hard.
Yeah, it is really hard. And you appreciate it when you watch the score,
Yeah.
but just listening to it, you might not
It
get
sounds like just one.
Absolutely. What was your question, Jacob?
Yeah. How do you approach writing for different ensembles? Like, for example, this semester I'm actually writing a solo saxophone piece, and I'm not typically used to writing for saxophone. And just my question is, how do you approach writing for different ensembles, like for a brass ensemble or a saxophone ensemble?
That's a good question. The first thing I always do is listen a lot. So when I sit down to write a brass piece, I will sit down and before I put my pencil to paper at all, I will listen to a whole bunch of brass music, stuff that I like, stuff that I don't expect to like, and I will ask friends if I'm writing for a person, which is important to me. I almost always, I actually can't remember the last time I just decided, I'm going to write for instrument X and just, sat down and started writing. I will find somebody that I want to write for and, and talk about putting a performance together. And when I do that, one thing I like to ask them about is what some of their favorite music for their instrument or ensemble is. And I listen to a lot of that as well, and we talk about what they like about it. I try to take advantage of the particular strengths of the instrument that I'm writing for, and the only way I can think to do that is to listen to some of those pieces. So I would say that it's going to be different for each piece, and that's kind of a cop-out composer answer, is how do you do whatever, and the answer is almost this is something that you'll hear from any composer if you ask them a question about how they do a particular thing across all their music. They'll almost universally say it's different for every piece. That's true.
So Jacob, I'm a saxophone player, obviously, and we've talked about your piece, but there's a difference between talking to me and the way that you feel about relating to me and relating to Wade Dillingham, as an example. Talking to your peer, you might end up asking questions and following lines of inquiry that you might not necessarily think to ask when you're dealing just with me. And it's better to get more than one opinion, too. So, yeah.
What saxophone are you writing for?
Alto sax.
Okay.
A practical choice.
Should listen to Sequenza 9.
It's a very good piece.
What's the guy's name?
Barrio.
Yeah, he's crazy.
They are crazy. I guarantee you, more than half of you would absolutely hate it.
You'd think I'd hate it, but actually I didn't play it.
Next question.
What's your primary instrument?
My primary instrument is trumpet.
But we're not going to hold that against him. Yeah.
Sam, you tell a dad joke as well as anybody I know.
That's right.
I was actually wondering, I don't know how much influence you had on the recording process. I said I don't know how much influence you had on the recording process, but there's something I noticed that was kind of interesting. as we were just watching the score, I marked it as letter J, that part, where it's kind of like, it's pretty quiet, but they're still doing the ascending melody and descending on the next measure. I was wondering, I heard the keys being played in the background, and that wasn't present throughout the whole piece, but I did notice it in like 2 or 3 sections. I was wondering if you did that on purpose, or if they did that by choice.
The particular engineer that they work with, his name is Sergei Kvitko, and he's recorded a lot of saxophone music. And that is mostly his preference. He does a fair amount. He mics very closely for saxophones and for a lot of instruments, and that's kind of his personal preference. I kind of like it. And if you were to hear a live performance of this at moments like letter J, where the players are all playing very softly, especially at the fourth bar of letter J, where you've got the big giant bari sax playing really softly in the thinnest part of its register, you're going to hear those key clicks really clearly in the hall. And so I don't mind it for that reason, because that's the way it sounds in a live performance. I know Sergei kind of does a little bit to minimize the key clicks in post, but it doesn't. I don't find it distracting. In fact, I find it kind of comforting that there's a machine and a person that's operating the machine making this music. The weirdest thing about actually the recording process, and I was in the room when they were in the recording sessions, and I was involved in picking out the cuts from the recording session. And so Sergei is a very good musician, but he doesn't play. He's a pianist. He doesn't play a ton of music that has a lot of weird meters like this. And at the end, where there are all those gaps, he was cutting out a lot of the rest that's written into the part, just because there's that one, and then there's the next one, and then there's the next one, and he wasn't counting through the rests, and so that required a little bit of tweaking.
But he's got a great ear.
He's got a great ear, yeah.
So just to make sure everyone understands, this was put together. How many takes total that it was all spliced together from, do you think, Dan?
Oh gosh, I don't know, dozens.
Dozens. So this is standard even for orchestral music, which for orchestral music creates some really unrealistic expectations of orchestras and performers. You know, you get the newest recording of some super duper badass violin concerto, and the way it sounds is not the way it's going to sound when you really go hear a person do it. So
I will say these guys play this just as badass as it sounds on this recording, and in fact, since they've made this recording, I've heard them play it a few times since the recording, and they actually play it a little faster than this recording goes.
I was going to say, I heard it once where it was still clean and cool, but it was scary and out of control, sort of a little bit like chugging forward
But they had
fast.
it under control.
They played it, but I don't think they could have played it much faster than they did.
I think I know the performance of which you speak.
Yeah, you and I were sitting next to each other. I remember going something like, "Woo, that was."
It's the first 2 measures go by, and Sam and I looked at each other like, oh boy, this could be interesting. But they drilled it. They nailed it.
Yeah.
Did they do it on purpose? I mean, were they just excited?
You know what happens on stage?
Yeah.
You know? Sometimes
Stuff happens.
Sometimes the dog gets out of the kennel and you just can't do anything about it.
Sometimes there's a little extra coffee beforehand. That's all there is.
Yes. Zach.
So did they record as an ensemble, or did they record each part separately and then have?
Oh no, they're all in the room recording. It's not tracked out like that.
Yeah.
But they are all in the studio together. I mean, they play together very, very well.
Yeah, I mean, you can listen to the piece, and this piece is like, not intentionally, I'm sure, but like it's almost built for splicing together out of different takes. Because like, I mean, even parts where they're running notes and they do the classical counterpoint where one voice goes up and another voice takes over and that kind of stuff, you can splice there and hide it even. And there's obviously lots of sonic holes in the piece, right? So it's real easy to splice it together out of chunks. Like
Even if it wasn't, Sergei's really good.
Yeah, I mean, he's really good, but that piece is such that even I, who am not that fantastic at that stuff, could splice it together in a convincing way. You know? More questions? Like,
What is the first step in your process when you get a new commission? Like, do they have input in what the piece is going to be, or do they just say, I want a piece from you, and you just go with an idea you've had, or is it all totally fresh for you and them?
Well, it's a good question. At the risk of repeating myself, it's actually going to be different for each piece and for each collaboration. Sometimes someone will contact me and say, hey, I need a piece for this occasion that accomplishes this thing, that honors whatever, or that is going to be performed by this kind of ensemble that has this limitations. It's got to be, it's going to be performed outdoors, or it needs to be something that a youth ensemble is capable of doing. And then other times it's very open-ended, and I will have to kind of pester them a little bit if I want to get any details. I mentioned sometimes I got a commission a few years ago from a youth orchestra, and we got, there's a lot of back and forth about what winds they had and what sorts of things the string section could do and what sorts of things they wouldn't be comfortable doing. And then most recently, this commission that Sam mentioned earlier to write a duo for two of these guys in the saxophone group, they want to do it at a concert for saxophonists, or at a conference rather for saxophonists. So it's very open-ended, and I had to ask them, well, you're going to do this in France. What saxophones are you going to bring with you to France? Because I'm not going to require you to bring an extra bass saxophone to France just to play this piece, because that's not a nice thing to do to somebody. So we spent some time talking about that and what kinds of rep that they currently play, so that I could know some things to listen to and what I might want. It started me thinking about what I could do to complement their current repertoire. I got out of them that they mostly play soprano and alto, and that currently their rep is pretty soprano heavy, and so I'm going to write this piece for two altos. But, if I wanted to write it for soprano and alto, or even if I did want to end up writing it for two basses, they would still play it because they can. It's always going to be a little bit different. Sometimes they're going to have a lot of restrictions, and other times they're going to say, do whatever you want, we trust you.
But thinking practically, and I know I've had the conversation about being practical with a lot of you. Think about it this way. You write it for two alto saxophones. Alto saxophone is like the primary act for legit saxophone players. They're always going to have it with them. So the chances of getting multiple performances of this piece increases if you write it for two altos. Would vastly decrease if you wrote it incorporating even a bass sax. But a bass sax, it would probably get premiered, and then the chances of it getting played again would be pretty small. So,
I will say, though, if I did write for bass sax, it would be pretty great, because the bass sax is pretty great. And you kind of have to balance that, right? I heard this wonderful performance by another one of the guys in this group, and he was a tiny little man playing a giant bass saxophone, and it was a really amazing performance. I don't know how often he gets to play it, but I felt like, at least from my perspective in the audience, it was worth it. You have to strike a balance, though. Just like I said earlier, this is not a piece that a lot of people could play. I could have written a piece very differently that would be much more approachable by younger or newer ensembles, and I chose not to. I chose to take advantage of what these guys can do on these instruments.
which suggests
These three guys and one highly qualified lady.
That's right. It suggests conversations I've also had with several of you about complexity for complexity's sake. I know that Dr. McDonald and I have both run up against wanting to write things and then feeling like, well, we better take it easy because we want it to get performed. And how magnificent it is. Somebody check and see what's going on with that. How magnificent it is. Do you have a class or something in here? All right. Or do you need to come in here right now? Can you give us another 7 minutes? I do. Thank you. I was supposed to be in another room and somebody stole it from me, so I apologize. Thank you. You want to you want to write a piece, and then you have to control yourself because you want to get it performed. And I think Dave would attest to, like, getting to write for H2 was like, yeehaw! You know, roll up your sleeves. It's time to go for it. Finally.
That's exactly what I even made that noise.
Yes.
I mean, there are definitely some moments in here that are the reason that it doesn't get performed more. There are some measures immediately following letter B that I regret sometimes, because they are the reason that it doesn't get performed more. Where there are fives overlapping with other fives.
Yeah. Feeling fiveness is not that easy for average people. Jeremy?
Yeah, this might be a personal question, I guess, but how many commissions do you receive, like, a year on average, you think?
I would say around 1 a year. I honestly, though, couldn't take many more than that, because I also teach full-time at one institution and part-time at another institution. So I don't think I could do many more than that. But I would say about 1 a year.
We've got some people in here chomping at the bit to write music and start selling it. That's a noble idea, and I wonder if you might have some things to say if that's your goal. A, what might you think about writing, and B, what might you do about trying to sell it?
Well, I would say, the first thing to do is make sure that you're writing great stuff, and that just takes a lot of practice writing stuff. And so the only way to get better at writing music is to write a lot of it. So start there for sure. And then to think about the kinds of ensembles that are looking for rep. In general, you're going to have a lot more competition writing for string quartet than writing for other things like saxophone quartet or percussion quartet or soloists even. A lot of soloists are looking for new rep, and that really can go for any instrument. Another great place that's full of people that are looking for new rep are wind ensembles, particularly educational ensembles. If you can learn to write a piece for a young band that is playable, but is also interesting, like musically interesting, and may even be kind of technically interesting in a way that could be an educational tool, you're going to sell as many copies as you can print at Kinko's. But in general, you just need to get practice writing things and get to know performers. That's the biggest thing. Practice writing stuff and develop relationships with performers. If you want to write for saxophones, develop relationships with saxophonists. If you want to write violin music, develop relationships with violinists. If you want to write for the educational wind band market, get to know band directors, get to know wind conductors. You're all in school with these people right now. If you walk through the hallways at school, the people that are also walking through the hallways with you are going to be your colleagues for the rest of your career. So get to know them and nice to them, which may seem trivial, but it's not. And if there's something you write for, go up. If you write a clarinet piece, find a clarinet player and say, hey, you want to work on something together? We can and pitch it as a thing that they can be involved in too. That it's not just you going off into your composer hut and come back from your vision quest 9 months later with this fully formed piece, but that you can come and work with them on a regular basis. The first collaboration I had with the people who I wrote this piece for, who you just heard performing it, was with the tenor saxophone player in this ensemble. And he and I had offices at Michigan State that were across the hall from one another. And I happened to have an office hour for my music theory student at the same time as his practice hour, which was in the middle of all of his lessons that he taught. And about once a week or two, he would come knock on my door and say, "Hey, look at this cool sound I figured out that I can make on my tenor saxophone." Or I would knock on his door and say, "Hey, I think I want to do something like this. Can you read through this and tell me how this feels on your instrument and what it sounds like when you do this versus this other thing?" And that process was the thing that led to my personal relationship with him, and then later this quartet that you heard, and then another saxophone piece and another saxophone piece. And so it's a matter of personal relationships.
Yes. It's getting to know people and expanding the network. I never wrote a piece for H2. I have a relationship with a guy that was the sax professor in New Mexico when I was going there, and I wrote a piece for his saxophone quartet. But because of my going to school with them, and really because of my connection to Dave also, I could send an unsolicited score to H2 and they would read it. That is an incredibly valuable commodity to be able to spend, and I likely will spend it one day. Just somebody who decides to write a sax quartet and sends it to H2, chances are it's not going to get read.
I would say actually, Sam, you would probably be more likely to send them an email and say, "Hey, I want to write a saxophone quartet. You want to work on something?"
Yeah.
You wouldn't sit down and write 10 minutes of music and then just send it off in a nice box or something.
Yeah. And it's just because of the personal relationship I have with them. It's also worth noting that as far as people want to make music and actually sell music and generate some income as a composer, Dave and I think our entire circle of friends, all the composers in that group, and there are quite a few, the person who sells the actual greatest amount of music, and I think I'm right about this, Dave, is our friend.
You're going to say Matt?
Matt Shadorf, because his brother is a band director is it middle school?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's like a 7th grade band.
But he writes educational and, some not necessarily educational, but younger band pieces, and writes them all the time, and they get published and published and published, and he sells them and sells them and sells them. He has a chapter in the something guide to writing for band.
He's got a chapter in Composers on Composing for Band, which is the Mark Camphouse book series. It's the same publisher as what is it? I'm blanking on it. Like Win Performance for Education or something. I don't remember what it is. There's a big famous series of books for music educators.
Right.
Teaching Music Through Performance in Band. That's what it's called.
Yes. So he absolutely sells more music than anybody I personally know.
And you know what? He writes that stuff a lot. So he has a lot of practice doing it. He works with the conductor, his brother. But he works with the conductor while he's writing these pieces. And for a long time, like probably close to 10 years or so, he was writing a piece every single year. And that was like an event that these guys did together. They would plan to every spring, at the end of every spring semester, premiere a new work. And that's a lot of writing.
It is. Writing for band is not easy. I mean, not easy as in it's just a lot of work because there's a lot of stuff to do, a lot of things to think about while you're in process.
Especially if you're dealing with young performers.
Yes.
There's a lot of money in writing for youth orchestras because there are tons of youth orchestras that can't play anything, but like they need stuff to play to help them technically.
Right.
Yeah, and there's great tons of stuff.
Absolutely.
That's what I want to do.
And I would say that there's probably a lot of composers who might write for that ensemble but don't really know how to write for strings well enough.
Yeah. Well, and there are plenty of youth orchestras. There are a lot of community youth orchestras, and there are a lot more community youth orchestras, but I feel like there are more school-sponsored bands. But more importantly, it's again people that you have the relationships with. I wrote a piece several years ago for a youth orchestra, again because I had a relationship with the conductor.
Could you say something about, because I know that there are people who fancy the idea of writing for orchestra generally, and we have now, as included in our concerto contest, I think everybody knows this, the concerto contest technically this year included it, but I don't think anybody was going to whip an orchestra piece out in like 2.5 months. But the concerto contest includes a compositional component, so you can write a piece for orchestra and enter it in the contest. I wonder if you might say something about the idea of writing for orchestra, Dave.
You've told them my joke, I assume.
I've probably told some of them, but it needs to come from you.
Okay. Well, so I would not just start off by writing an orchestra piece from nothing. If you're going to write for orchestra, it really needs to be something that you have arranged beforehand with the conductor and the ensemble to know what you're working with, and to know that you're writing for somebody that's excited about performing it. When Sam and I were young whippersnappers coming up in music composition, everybody wants to write for orchestra, right? That's what you hear on well, this is back when people used to listen to classical radio. But that's what you would hear on the radio, and that's like would kind of be the apex of classical music composition. And the thing is, there aren't that many orchestras, and there are even fewer of them that are playing anything written in the last 10 years, much less the last 110 years. My joke has always been that writing for orchestra is like buying a lottery ticket that costs a year of your life. It's a year of work. I mean, that's probably a pretty serious piece, obviously, but it's a lot of work, and it's way too much work to just put into something that you're gonna stick in a drawer. It's great to have had the experience of writing for orchestra, but you're not going to learn nearly as much or get anything out of putting the thing in a drawer somewhere and just having the score. Music is sounds, and it's not the thing on the page.
I want to know, like, where you might start. You said that you wouldn't just start from nowhere. Like, would you maybe start with, like, taking the strings and getting an idea of stuff to do the strings and then add brass? Like, what did you mean you wouldn't start from nothing?
I wouldn't just go off on my own and say, today I begin my symphony, right? I would start working with a conductor. That's what I meant. And you can even, it's totally reasonable when you do this, by the way. It's totally reasonable to schedule the premiere before you put a single note on the page and say, what does your season look like next year? Do you have room for a 6-minute piece on your program in April? And if they do, say, all right, that's great. When do you need the score and parts? And don't be late. Don't miss deadlines.
Don't miss deadlines. Or lessons.
It's really important to not miss deadlines.
Yes, Austin.
You said that if you write orchestra or for orchestra, that it might end up in your drawer mostly. Well, I was wondering, you say it's probably the same for if you're doing that for film or television, or
it's the same in that you would want to work with a director or a producer. It could be valuable to put together some kind of reel, and that might require you doing some smaller scenes or something, just so that you've got a demo reel for film or video games or something like that. I mean, music for media, it's really hard, unless you're working on student projects, it's really hard to get the gig without anything. Like, they're going to want to hear something, especially since you're dealing with non-musicians that aren't going to be able to look at a score and know what it sounds like or what it means. And also a big part of getting those kinds of music for media gigs is being able to create the sounds. And you need to demonstrate that you can do that as well. And so they're going to want a little demo reel, and that might be putting together some scenes and writing some stuff for that. But in general, you're gonna want to get to know some people, make those things, and make those kinds of decisions.
Our next studio class will have an accomplished film composer and another colleague of mine and Dave's, Dr. Kevin Wilt, is going to talk to us, and he does film music, both in
another Floridian, by the way.
Sorry, you buffed for a minute there. What'd you say?
Would you say another Florida composer?
Yeah. So he does actual acoustic dots and lines, people reading the music kind of music, but also generates music, as I've mentioned to many of you, using a sample library and putting it together electronically, but it still sounds like an orchestra.
And the best stuff that he does like that is a combination of the two.
Yeah. A great deal of music you hear on television that sounds like orchestra music is made that way these days.
Yeah. In fact, Sam mentioned our podcast. On that same site, I produce a podcast that Kevin hosts about film music. We interviewed the woman that writes the music and has written the music for, I think it's a run of Bones, David Boreanaz's show. And she said that in the whole, it's something like 8-season run of that show, she had only gotten live players, and they were just soloists, like one player twice. Everything else for the whole run of that show is samples. That's not unusual.
And just to talk about how awesome that podcast is, they've had the composer that does the music for the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
He gets a live orchestra. That show's got a music budget.
Yeah, it's a superhero thing, so of course they get money.
Well, no, it's Disney.
Oh, that must be it.
How much different is that, like that sampling software versus the notation software? Like to actually.
Well, you kind of use them together,
Okay.
Well, it's more complicated than that. People who really do it have separate rack-mounted computers that control the woodwinds and another separate computer for the brass. It's a big, expensive, technically challenging ordeal.
Yeah, Kevin's probably dumped more money into sample libraries than I have dumped into my car.
So,
I don't even think I'm exaggerating.
in the ins and out of that system, we will get into, because I'm sure everyone is going to have, if you're interested in video game music, that's almost like saying, it's really saying I'm interested in film music, except the way the music works is a little more quirky. I actually don't know that much about how. We need to find somebody who knows.
I'm learning about it in audio and multimedia.
Oh, there you go. You can teach me about it then, Lizzie.
I'll bring the book when I get it.
Does anyone else have any questions? Michael?
You talked earlier about when you're first composing a piece, using writing down everything to begin with and only using the computer when it becomes too complicated. Is there any particular reason that you start writing it down?
Yes, that's a great question, and the biggest reason, this is really important. This is really easy to forget, and I'm a person that grew up when I was writing papers, in as much as you write papers in middle school, I was typing them on a computer. I grew up doing stuff on a computer. Sam is much, much, much older than I am. But when I write music, that's a different enough thing for me, and the tools for music notation on a computer are designed to make certain kinds of writing very easy. And it's very important to me that I am making all of the decisions that I'm making very intentionally, and that I'm not making a compositional decision, a musical decision, based on what is hard or easy to make the computer do. All of that meter stuff that's in that piece that we listened to tonight would have been very tedious to enter, and I may have, even if I didn't mean to, even if it's just subconscious, have not written some of those same rhythms or same meters simply because of how they're written on the page and how I enter those into Sibelius. And I want to make sure that when I go from 5/16 to 7/16, as wacky as that sounds, that I'm doing that for a musical reason. And the same thing, it's especially true of freer music where I want the performer to either make some of their own decisions or that I want to notate in a little bit of a looser way. That's very difficult to do on a computer. They're not meant to do that, right? They're meant to write arrangements of the Star-Spangled Banner for a brass band. They're not made to have an open-ended repeating section that goes underneath another thing that's in 3 different meters. Like that's not And I don't know if I would want to do that, but I would like to make that decision entirely musically every time.
That being said, I know for a fact that there are people in this room that compose straight into the computer. Don't think that I don't know.
I don't know if you guys can still hear me, but I lost you for a second.
You there, David? Hello? David?
Yes.
Okay.
I lost you for a second.
Okay. I know for a fact that some of you compose straight into the computer, and, as we go along, we'll talk about that. I don't want to slow you down at this point, but it is something you need to think about. I'm not going to say I forbid it, but you need to have some experience writing not that way at the very least. When I was a younger composer, I composed straight into finale 100% of the time, right? And now I almost exclusively compose on paper. But the caveat I'll say, one sec, is like I will write a section where I will write down a musical idea, and then I will say finish with finale, because it's something that is amenable to the way finale works. And I'll say I'm just going to do a bunch of copy and paste, blah 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 blah, because that's what it needs to be. But I've made that decision. I just know that finale can do it for me very easily, right?
Yeah, I'm not trying to do a finished product on paper. I'm not trying to imitate everything that I would want to put in the computer on paper. But I want to start on paper because it is much freer than the computer. And Sam says that he doesn't require his students to start on paper, but I require my students to start on paper.
He teaches all composition majors. I will say that it's also, notation programs have always been able to play back, but I have Finale 2014, and it's like a notation program slouching heavily towards being a sequencer, right? That's just the way those notation programs have become. And it's almost like I've known lots of composers that are like this. It's almost like they write pieces for finale, That's not for human beings to play. That's for finale to play. Because you can put reverb and all kinds of other things on the individual tracks. Tracks is what he calls the staves, right? So you have to be careful about that. And the people who do compose straight into the computer, I monitor them to make sure they're not getting unrealistic. Any other questions?
Sibelius or finale?
I personally use Sibelius, though I do not have anything against finale. It is simply what I mean. So when I started using Sibelius, it was definitely inferior. It definitely could not do the things that finale can do. But much like other pieces of software, they all steal from one another, and when one of them develops something amazing and groundbreaking, the other one steals it. And so now they can do mostly the same things now. It's just a matter of what you're used to. But I like Sibelius, and I think it looks better and does everything better.
There was another question somewhere here.
I'm not sure, I want to hear very specifically why you prefer your students and yourself to start on paper. Just because you're not having any influence because you're not hearing it, you know that it's coming straight out of your head, or what?
So the computer makes certain things difficult. It makes a lot of forms of non-traditional notation very difficult. It makes it very difficult to draw certain symbols. It makes it very difficult to have open-ended meters and certain kinds of polymeters. It's not conducive to that because it's not what the tool is designed to make expedient. It's designed to do those things if you spend a lot of time hammering on it, but I don't want to do something in my music just because it's easier to notate in the computer than it is to write with a pencil on paper. And then it's especially important when I'm doing kind of what I would describe loosely as pre-writing, when the thing that I'm doing is a musical idea, but it does not make sense as a section of a musical score. And Finale and Sibelius are not designed to do anything other than a final score and a final part. But a lot of the process of writing music involves putting things together that are not complete ideas yet.
I've been writing on paper just because I don't want to lose my ideas through how the heck do I put this in here?
Exactly.
How many 8 notes in a bar of 6/8? 6. How many 8 notes in a bar of 3/4? 6. So try to get Finale to put a bar of 6/8 here and a bar of 3/4 hair and have two parts going simultaneously. It'll make you want to rip your hair out, you know.
Right.
With a pencil, I can do it pretty easily, right?
But then how are you eventually supposed to put it in there?
Well, you go through the laborious process of making it happen, but
At least you've got your idea out first.
exactly. Actually, now you can do that a lot easier than it used to be able to.
So this is, I'll show you an example. You probably can't read anything that's on this webcam, but this is a piece, another saxophone piece. I don't know if you can see any of that notation, but if I had to do that on the computer first, I would never have written any of this stuff, right? All those weird boxes and those weird things, and here's another page of that same thing. It's got these drawings, basically. And I would not have done that if I had to do that. I had to make those drawings basically in a graphics program and bring them into Sibelius. And I was doing that because I was imitating something that I had drawn with a Sharpie on a piece of paper.
Now, we do have someone in the class who is a new student this semester who's very interested in electronic music, where the artifact that the composer has when they are done with their work is not even necessarily a piece of paper with dots and lines on it. It is the music, right? It's important to note that that's a different thing, you know. The principal object being created is the finished product, not a set of instructions that give you the finished product, right? If you guys don't know, Derek, who's new to the studio, is very adept at using a sequencing platform, and we listen to a lot of his music today. We're going to figure out how to make that music and make it composition with a capital C, right? That's fine. If anybody, we've been here a little over an hour. If anybody needs to go, I understand. Now here's the bonus section. If anybody wants to ask music business questions, Dr. McDonald is quite a scholar in the field. And Jessica, please remember to send me that date.
I sent it to you.
Thank you. If anybody has any music business questions, fire away. Austin.
Is there any one thing, or maybe just a unique thing that could make someone stand out? I mean, nowadays, and with so many people that are trying to go after the same goal.
Any one thing. I mean, nothing is going to make anybody stand out better than having really good stuff. And anything that comes before making really good stuff is secondary. That all needs to go away until you've got something really great. Then you can find ways to share that with people. And the ways to share that with people is through your personal relationships that I talked about before with regard to working with performers. You know, I have a lot of saxophonists that know who I am because I've written a lot of music that has been performed for them, and I have wonderful musicians that champion my music. And that only happens because the music that I first wrote was, well, I think it's pretty good, and I guess they did too. So that to me is the first thing, and then just being available, being, again, it sounds stupid, but being nice. One of the nicest people I know is also one of the most successful composers I know. Go ask Sam for some recordings of Joel Puckett's music.
Good composer, writes a really great band music, lots of other stuff too, and just the nicest guy ever. He's on an episode of Sound Notion, if you just search his name on Sound Notion. You know, it's worth noting that, like, how do you know, quote, the question we were waiting to hear was the one voiced this way: how do you get your music out there? Well, it's through personal relationships, and starting a podcast about new music is not a bad way to develop those relationships. I think Dave would agree.
Sure. I'm never quite sure what people mean when they ask that question, though. What does out there mean to people, and there's not an out there. It's just people.
Like, there's a very solid chance. I mean, I've gotten a tentative yes that we're going to have at a Masterclass sometime during the semester. I guess I don't know if he owns it, but
He's a co-founder for sure of New-Am.
Co-founder of New Amsterdam Records, which is one of the biggest labels producing new classical, you know, or part music out there. Judd Greenstein. we were testing this to make sure it worked, and this goes through your Google Plus account, and
Sam accidentally sent an email to like 150 people about it.
Everybody who's in all my circles, I accidentally said, hey, I'm doing this thing, and it says, you write a composition to a Masterclass text. And then Judd responded and said, what's this? So I wrote a response, and I said, Dave's doing a Masterclass, and he knows who Dave is. And I said, I would ask you, but I know you're too expensive. Thinking, who knows what he'll say? Well, what do you think he said? I'd be happy to do it. I'm really busy right now, but it'll have to be later. And how did that happen? Because of my personal relationship. We had him on our podcast. He knows Dave. He knows Dave is doing this.
Because we're nice.
There it is. That's how it happened. Some people have to leave.
Bye, everybody.
Any more business questions of any kind? Yes, Jamal.
What do you think is the key step of having a successful publication of your music or composition?
Write good music.
It's a successful publication. Write good music, but also make super professional parts. The score and parts have to be impeccable. Right? Imagine what you would think if you got a book that was a self-published book and it had a bunch of typos in it, or the page skipped the page numbers or something like that. You would immediately think that the person that made it was a total joker. But if you got a beautiful handcrafted book that had everything right, you would think, wow, this is a person that really cares about making a really great thing. So it's got to be as close to perfect as you can make it. And it's another one of those things you kind of just have to practice doing, and it may require, especially at the beginning, may require a lot of repeat trips to your local FedEx office, Kinko's, copy shop, whatever, to get it right.
Somewhere in the Quad Cities area.
Well, I'm sure you've got some printing situation. Or you may have to mail order. Like there's mail order, like people send in postcards and stuff like you did in the 70s. But anyway, go online and have stuff printed and mailed to you. And it might take a few tries to learn the best way to do that. It's not easy because the people that are producing that stuff aren't used to printing performance materials. But you gotta have performance ready materials. Look at the Major Orchestra Librarians Association's guide, the MOLA guide, M-O-L-A, and even if you're not writing orchestra music, a lot of their guidelines are pretty solid. You don't have to follow all of them to the T, but take a look at what their recommendations are, and always compare to stuff from major publishers, and make your stuff look as close to that as you can. But you got to have, even before all of that stuff, you got to have a great piece of music that people are going to want to listen to. We're gonna
have to wrap up because of the room confusion. Let me translate that last point into something that's very salient for you guys. Don't write dotted rhythms that disguise beats. You. Okay, you know what I'm talking about. Right?
I just had this discussion today with 3 of my students.
All right, so sorry to end so abruptly, but we got to bug out. Let's have a round of applause.
It's nice talking to you all. It was great questions.
I got to close the computer and go.
Feel free to send me an email if you guys have any other questions that you didn't get to. I'm happy to answer emails.
All right. Thanks, Dave. I'll call you and we'll debrief in a minute.
Indeed.